Who was Jesus? And what made people rush out to greet him like he was the revolutionary coming to town? We know he was a traveling healer who did not discriminate among different classes or religions, ethnicities, or genders, or purity customs. Bible stories tell about Jesus touching people who had leprosy and healing them, how he allowed the woman who was suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years to touch his cloak and be healed. He healed the Gentile woman's daughter across faiths. He talked to the Samaritan woman at the well. He sat and ate meals with tax collectors who were despised and others who were called sinners. He was a wisdom teacher who spoke in parables, trying to make sense out of nonsense in a world where people felt powerless and were yearning for a better life. Some say he was a spirit-filled person, unusually close to God, whom he called by the familiar name Abba, an Aramaic word that a child would use to address their father. Jesus was a Jewish man who led a renewal movement within his faith, encouraging others to live by the spirit of the law and not the letter. He was steeped in Jewish tradition and in the economic and political realities of his time. He heard the resonance at the Passover Seder when the ancient story of liberation from slavery was told and retold. When Jesus entered Jerusalem for the Passover festival on what turned out to be his final week, he came into the city riding on a donkey, which was a symbol of a humble peacemaker. The way the story is told in the Bible, Jesus' entry to Jerusalem sounds a little mysterious, but some biblical scholars claim it was a carefully planned political street demonstration. Because the Jewish people of Jesus' time knew their orally transmitted scripture, they knew the story from the prophet Zechariah, who predicted that sometime in the future, a king would be coming to Jerusalem, quote, humble and riding on a colt, the foal of a donkey, to command peace to the nations. The people would have known what it meant when they saw Jesus riding into the city on a donkey. Finally, a humble revolutionary to liberate them from the brutal economic and political oppression of the Roman Empire. The people would have gone mad with joy. Their ankles be uncrossed, their bodies would jump up, arms waving in the air, throwing their cloaks on the ground in front of him, grabbing leafy branches to wave, shouting with joy at last. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan make many claims in their book, The Last Week, What the Gospels Really Teach About Jesus' Final Days in Jerusalem. Most fascinating to me is their interpretation of what has come to be known as Palm Sunday in the Christian tradition. As a background to this holiday, we need to remember that Jesus was a Jewish person and that Passover was the biggest festival of the year, bringing thousands and thousands of people, mostly peasants, on pilgrimage into the city. Borg and Crossan write, by the 1st century, Jerusalem had been the center of sacred geography of the Jewish people for a millennium. It became the capital of ancient Israel in the time of King David, around 1000 BCE. A glorious temple was built by David's son Solomon in the 900s BCE, which became the sacred center of God's presence and a destination for pilgrimage. But, they say, Jerusalem also acquired negative associations when it became the center of a domination system. Domination system, they say, is just shorthand for a way of organizing a society, which in Jesus' time was a pre-industrial agrarian society. It is a social system marked by three features: political oppression, economic exploitation, and religious legitimation. The many were ruled by the few wealthy elites. A high percentage of the society's wealth went into the coffers of the powerful rulers, and the system was justified with religious language. They say there's nothing unusual about that form of society. Monarchical and aristocratic rule by a wealthy few began 5,000 years ago and was the most common form of social system in the ancient world. Well, as you're hearing this, I imagine, like me, you might be hearing some resonance to our own times, even though we are not peasants in a pre-industrial society. Political oppression, economic exploitation, and religious legitimation, the language legitimizing what's happening. I think it helps to know that a domination system was firmly in place when Jesus was leading his Jewish renewal movement and when early Christianity formed after his death. It puts these stories into context. We need to know that people during Jesus' lifetime were living under Roman occupation. Most people were living at a subsistence level. There was widespread poverty. The Roman occupiers regularly suppressed peasant uprisings by selling people into slavery and crucifying the leaders of rebellions. Thousands of people were crucified before and after Jesus. It was not the first time. This was a cruel and yet common way for the oppressor to frighten and silence people who were seeking liberation. Then into this environment comes Jesus, who challenged the social, religious, and economic status quo through his preaching, teaching, and practice of inclusive community. He gave people hope that things might change, that things could be different. The people living in these desperate conditions needed hope. They needed change. They wanted a leader to follow into freedom. They welcomed Jesus into the midst of their pain with unbounded joy. When Jesus rode into Jerusalem for the Passover festival, people threw those leafy branches on the ground in front of him on that muddy road. They threw down their cloaks before him, and these were gestures of joy and hope. And they were symbolic gestures. This is what people in that time did before a royal procession. But the dangerous thing was, there couldn't be two kings in the Roman Empire. According to Roman imperial theology, the emperor was not simply the ruler of Rome, but the Son of God. So when Jesus was hailed as the Son of God, that could not be tolerated by those in power. We need to keep in mind there's only so much that we can know about the time in which Jesus lived and what he did with his life. The stories in the gospel were written some 40 to 70 years after Jesus was killed. And the stories were written for their audiences of faith, not as historical documents. Historian Riza Aslan writes in his book Zealot, there are only two hard historical facts about Jesus of Nazareth upon which we can confidently rely. The first is that Jesus was a Jew who led a popular Jewish movement in Palestine at the beginning of the 1st century CE. The second is that Rome crucified him for doing so. Crucifixion was a punishment that Rome reserved almost exclusively for the crime of sedition. The plaque that the Romans placed above Jesus' head that said, "King of the Jews," was not meant to be sarcastic. Every criminal who hung on a cross received a plaque declaring the specific crime for which he was being executed. Jesus' crime in the eyes of Rome was striving for kingly rule, i.e. treason, the same crime for which nearly every other messianic aspirant of the time was killed. Well, Unitarian Universalists hold a wide variety of beliefs and opinions about who Jesus was. We range from believing he was an important role model, to claiming he was a social revolutionary, to claiming and viewing him as one of the most spiritually evolved human beings, to considering him divine, to questioning whether he lived at all. Since we live in this country saturated with a wide variety of Christianities, it behooves us to figure out what we believe about Jesus, especially if we have been harmed by what someone told us about him, especially if the religion about Jesus has been used against us. It's okay to claim Jesus as a role model, even as a Unitarian Universalist. It's okay to claim him as a teacher, a healer, a spirit-filled person. It's okay to claim Jesus as a social revolutionary if it helps us be brave and fight for freedom under the current domination system in which we live. The U.S. Army Chorus sang the epilogue finale from Les Mis at the White House Governor's Ball, hosted by Donald and Melania Trump on February 22nd, 2025. You may know it's a ballad about fighting tyranny from the hit 1980 musical about the Paris Uprising of 1832, an anti-monarchist insurrection. Now, many interpret the symbolic nature of the U.S. Army singing this song to the new administration as a gutsy display of resistance, a middle finger, so to speak. Do you hear the people singing the song of angry ones? It is the music of a people who will not be slaves again. Will you join in our crusade? Who will be strong and stand with me? Somewhere beyond the barricade, is there a world you long to see? In both his 2016 and 2024 campaigns, Trump used this song at his rallies, twisting the symbolism as if democratic presidencies were tyrannies. But on Easter next week, we anticipate President Trump will invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act, a federal law that empowers the president to deploy the military and National Guard in the United States in particular circumstances, such as to suppress rebellion, in essence, declaring martial law against its own people. Ironic, yes? Given that the self-same man, as outgoing president in 2021, encouraged a mob to breach the U.S. Capitol walls to stop the Electoral College vote. Under the guise of border security, and we're not talking Canada, the president might use the Insurrection Act to impose martial law at the southern border. But we know him, and we know that is likely not the only place he might use it. I had a moment on Saturday, April 5th, at the protest in front of the federal building in downtown Milwaukee. As I entered this tight throng of people a block away, My eyes met the eyes of a police officer standing on the corner of the intersection. Our eyes met and held for just a few seconds, and then he looked away. In that moment, I realized we were both wearing costumes. I was wearing my clerical collar, he was wearing his uniform. And it made me wonder, how would we use our power that day? How would we use our symbols of authority? Then a week later, I suddenly realized that was not a police officer at all. You can tell I'm not very experienced in protesting. That was a protester. He was decked out in PPE, personal protective equipment, the big gas mask, the goggles, the tightly fitted neoprene black shirt with the hoodie over his slight, slender torso, and then a heavy belt with different compartments for different things. He didn't wear a badge. There wasn't another officer with him. There was no helmet, shield, billy club. And of course, it made me remember there could have been plainclothes officers mingling throughout the crowd. What did I really know about this protest? What I remember most about that day was a fierce and urgent joy that was permeating the people, peacefully demanding what we know we deserve in a democracy: freedom from tyranny. UU minister Lynn Unger wrote in her poem, Passover, "They thought they were safe that spring night when they daubed the doorways with sacrificial blood. To be sure, the angel of death passed them over, but for what? 40 years in the desert without a home, without a bed, following new laws to an unknown land. Easier to have died in Egypt or stayed there a slave, pretending there was safety in the old familiar." But the promise from those first naked days outside the garden is that there is no safety, only the terrible blessing of the journey. You were born through a doorway marked in blood. We are all of us, passed over, brushed in the night by terrible wings. Ask that fierce presence whose imagination you hold. God did not promise that we shall live, but that we might at last glimpse the stars, brilliant in the desert sky. Friends, in this spiritual community, it is not our role to tell each other what to do, but to listen to and follow our hearts and minds until the next right thing calls us into service for the greater good. 20th century monk Thomas Merton wrote, "It seems to me that I have greater peace and am close to God when I am not trying to be a contemplative or trying to be anything special, but simply orienting my life fully and completely towards what seems to be required of a person like me at a time like this." What is required of us? Who will we follow and how far? What if there is no leader? What if the power is in the people? What if? What if?